The Honourable Selwyn Figueras.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour and privilege to rise to address this House on the appropriation bill for the fourth and final time before the end of this Parliament and a general election before the end of the year. It is the practice in this House for the members to make their contributions in relation to the bill and to the budget book, the outturns and estimates, and to then make general statements of party political positions, setting out by way of consolidation the issues that have been the feature of the last 12 months in politics. This debate is, Mr. Speaker, the opportunity we get every year to sit down, collate, organise and present political arguments on our respective portfolios without fear of interruption, as a general rule at least, or without hindrance by the rules of or without, indeed, hindrance by the rules of question and answer sessions. Given that we are in an election year, and more particularly given that time is ticking down to the end of my time and that of all those present in this chamber, in this Parliament, I also propose to revisit, as has the Honourable the Chief Minister, a variety of themes that have coloured the debates across this floor since December 2011. In dealing with my areas of responsibility, I will touch lightly upon the figures set out in the budget book, which, as ever, makes fascinating reading. In relation to planning, justice, traffic and transport, there really isn't very much to write home about, beyond a handful of specific points which I will make once more this year in relation to the justice portfolio, which I turn to deal with now. Mr. Speaker, I am grateful to the Minister for his contribution to the debate. This is an area of government business where largely there is agreement across the floor of the House. In the companies and insolvency context, I can report that in my dealings with London professionals wearing my business development hat, the concept of a new companies and insolvency regime has been welcome and certainly, from the professional point of view, a positive development in the message about Gibraltar PLC's appeal as a centre for structured and asset finance transactions. The coming into force of the new body of legislation, a not insignificant series of changes, has represented a real shot in the arm for the purposes of selling the jurisdiction in the context I have just alluded to, being an insolvency regime which, although new to us, is certainly not new to UK practitioners who can turn to a body of jurisprudence established in England and Wales, familiar to those who practice this area of law. Having lost some ground over the years to other centres, I am confident and expect that others in this room and beyond are, that we might now be able to work to recover some of that lost ground. In relation to his comments on the prison, Mr. Speaker, I am happy to hear that the atmosphere at the prison remains relaxed. Indeed, I venture to suggest that it might be even more relaxed given that they now get their weekend premiums following the Honourable Chief Minister's address yesterday. It is also welcome news to hear of all the EU initiatives that Gibraltar is signed up to in the context of cooperation, because anything that brings us closer to the European family of law enforcement is good news indeed. Finally, Mr. Speaker, on the address of the Honourable Minister, I look forward to debating the proceeds of crime legislation as published and as he indicated would be taken during July. Mr. Speaker, in the justice portfolio, one issue stands out above the rest as a source of dispute between us, and that is the government's handling of legal aid and assistance. It is an issue, Mr. Speaker, which frankly was worthy of probably a much more mischievous use than that to which we have put it, Mr. Speaker. I have raised it on a number of occasions when the opportunity has arisen, and yes, it is one of those stalwart issues that is covered here every year, and with good cause, Mr. Speaker. The background to it goes thus, and I'm quoting from a short excerpt of my own speech last year, saying that the GSLP Liberal Manifesto contains a commitment to increase the limits of qualification for legal aid and assistance and to explore other mechanisms to ensure citizens have appropriate legal representation when they need it. It goes on to say, and I quote, "Although there is a draft bill ready, these have not been increased for many years and a lot of people who should be eligible and need legal aid or assistance are not getting the cover," end quote. Despite the not insignificant amount of very good work that the Honourable Minister and his team have done in justice, which I am very happy to point out to congratulate him once more, they have not delivered on the manifesto commitment on legal aid and assistance. Indeed, instead, Mr. Speaker, what has happened is that in 2012, new rules on legal aid were published, effectively extending the gift of unlimited legal aid to 4 defendants in the Marache case. The rules excluded defendants in any other complex cases other than fraud, a fact which the Minister himself conceded in accepting that there could indeed be complex cases not involving fraud. It is a matter of public interest and intrigue why this was done the way it was. Of course, Mr. Speaker, in the most recent exchanges on this issue in September last year, the government sought to dismiss the suggestion that there was anything worthy of legitimate criticism in the change by alluding to legal advice that the government had received from the chambers of my learned and honourable friend Mr. Borsino, in the hope, one expects, that it might silence the opposition. Mr. Speaker, what would certainly be quite improper would be for us to accept that statement Mr. Speaker, what would certainly be quite improper would be for us to accept that statement and the government's interpretation of the advice at face value when, as the Minister himself has conceded, there were other cases where the rules should, by implication, have been extended to apply. The lack of an indication as to what distinguished, at the time, one set of cases from another meant that no compelling enough reason for the differing approaches could be deduced from the government's position. The consequence of the change in the rules in 2012 was the meteoric rise in the legal aid and assistance charge on the Consolidated Fund. In the financial year 2010-2011, Mr. Speaker, in the financial year 2010-2011, the amount of charge on the Consolidated Fund was £623,202. In the next financial year, 2011-2012, which straddled administrations, that sum went to £1,049,863, an increase, given that everybody has developed a penchant for speaking in percentage terms, of 168%, Mr. Speaker, year on year. In the next financial year, 2012-2013, which was the responsibility exclusively of the new GSLP Liberal government, that sum shot up to £2,210,557, an increase, Mr. Speaker, of 211%. The next year, 2013-2014, the sum peaked at £2,653,000, Mr. Speaker. An increase year on year of 120%, but Mr. Speaker, that increase year on year is not actually the most spectacular one. If you compare the figure for the financial year 2010-2011 to the peak in 2013 and 2014 of 2,653,000, it is a frankly astonishing percentage increase of 426%, Mr. Speaker. Then in 2014 and 2015, that sum went down to 1,850,000, and the estimate for next year is 1.2 million. I suspect that it is not a matter of coincidence, that it is because the case is at the stage that it is at, and that there have been the changes that there have been, that the figure will continue to drop. The position today, Mr. Speaker, as brought about by the changes in the rules published in 2014 that the Minister himself talked about, is that if another Maharaja case came along, the kind of expense of in the region of £10 million to which this community was put would not happen again. What the new rules in 2014 did, Mr. Speaker, as a transitional provision, was to ensure that cases covered by the old 2012 rules would, until the conclusion of said matters, continue to be covered by those rules. As you might have guessed, Mr. Speaker, the Maharaja case was the only case covered by this provision. The defence by this government on this issue has, unlike their defence in other areas of policy, been weak by comparison. On early challenge by my honourable and learned friend, the Leader of the Opposition, and in answers to questions a couple of years ago, the Honourable Minister said that they weren't going to reform legal aid in a piecemeal fashion, but with respect to the Honourable Minister, that's exactly what they did. They have brought before this House a large catalogue of legislation, one that they can sincerely be proud of, including very substantial items such as the Companies and Insolvency Acts of last year. But they have not yet got round to making changes to the levels of qualification for legal aid and assistance they suggested in the manifesto so badly needed. The Honourable Minister inherited draft legislation that had been prepared in consultation with the industry and could have made to that draft bill such changes as circumstances or policy dictate today. What he cannot do with respect, Mr. Speaker, is to take the better part of 4 years in government reviewing and considering draft legislation, one which the Honourable Mr. Likuti told us he had in February 2012. As I said last year, Mr. Speaker, the issue came to the fore not just because it was an important issue in its own right, not because they had set it out as such in their manifesto, but because of the piecemeal way in which, by defining a class of defendants into which at the time practically only the Maharajas would fit, the government effectively wrote a blank cheque to one group of defendants. As I said, Mr. Speaker, We could have made much more of this issue by incessantly and repeatedly reminding the electorate of the staggering expense in this case. I chose not to, Mr. Speaker, but that does not alter the fact that the government footed a bill to the tune of 0.6% of GDP, and that is based on the latest figure of £1.64 billion. However significant the growth, whatever the economic health of this community is down to, we cannot allow ourselves to be blinded by the many numbers and the many zeros we have been looking at for the last few weeks. £10 million is not a sum of money to turn one's nose up at, and the fact that such an amount of money was spent on one case, regardless of the result, cannot simply be dismissed as an anomaly without explanation or indeed accepted at face value, just like that. The story is somewhat different with the outcome and expense of the Giraldi inquiry, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition touched upon the issue in his own intervention, and we will all recall, some more or less fondly than others, the lengthy debate on the motion filed by the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, which, by virtue of political devices available to 10-man governments standing opposite 7-man oppositions in 17-member parliaments, like ours, became, to my mind, one of the most unpleasant and unsavoury days of my short career in this House. I was counselled earlier this week to speak about issues that matter to me during this, my final address in this Parliament, and I speak, as suggested, from the heart, Mr. Speaker, when I say that witnessing the Honourable, the Father of the House, delivering his piece on the motion, oozing as it was with barely contained fury and a generous helping of contempt for the Chairman of the inquiry, I found it difficult viewing, Mr. Speaker. Not difficult because of any notion that anything the Honourable, the Father of that House was saying was either powerful or compelling enough, in my view, to diminish the importance of the conclusion of the inquiry. Not difficult either, Mr. Speaker, because the Honourable, the Father of the House was in any way legitimately deconstructing the Chairman's view of the behaviour of and evidence given by members, current and past, of the GSD government during the period of time in question. No, Mr. Speaker. It was difficult viewing of a display which turned out to be an example of how the parliamentary privilege and, of course, parliamentary practice could be used by a member of this here Parliament to play to a party political audience and, without even the slightest hint of remorse for his targeting of the Chairman and his work, to make a mockery of an inquiry that had cost the better part of £4 million and which they themselves had commissioned, Mr. Speaker. When the Chief Minister then rose to speak and described Mr. Pisano's intervention as a tour de force, I was even more surprised. One develops a thick skin rather quickly. At the sharp end of politics in Gibraltar. But I have to admit that I came away from that debate finding it impossible to fathom how smug, yes, smug, some of the ministers looked at the end of that debate. A debate and an inquiry that they themselves had commissioned, as the collegiate cabinet government that they are, and then gone on to spend millions of taxpayers' money on, and which they had just witnessed the Honourable, the Father of the House, trying to rubbish, in addition to the reputation of the President of the Court of Appeal. And they seemed entirely comfortable with it. Proud, even. Absolutely. Never mind, Mr. Speaker, I suppose it's all part of the learning curve.
Absolutely.
Moving on briefly to touch upon planning before finally moving on to talk about traffic and transport. I'm sorry, is that it? Mr. Speaker, the Honourable the Chief Minister from sedentary position informs me that he's not the President of the Court of Appeal, that he is in fact just a member, and I'm grateful for the correction.
He's the President of the...
Mr. Speaker, moving on to briefly touch upon planning, before finally moving on to talk about traffic and transport, I'd like to start by congratulating the Honourable the Deputy Chief Minister for the progress that he and his department have made in this area. The fact that the minutes of the meetings of the DPC are now, as well as the agendas, published online along with the applications and supporting information in respect of government projects are clearly positive developments, as is the holding of meetings in public. I'd like to congratulate them too, Mr. Speaker, for being masterful at identifying areas of policy where the Honourable and Learned Sir Peter Caruana, conviction politician that he is, had not given ground on, and in respect of which they saw the opportunity to put easy and clear blue water between themselves and the then Chief Minister. What the Honourable members did with the DPC, along with a number of other initiatives in the time since they were elected, was to take areas of policy in respect of which they could easily, starkly even, cast themselves as the diametric opposite of the Honourable and Learned Sir Peter Caruana's GSD in 2011. The holding of meetings in public of the DPC is one such example. You see, Mr. Speaker, by adding more people to the committee and holding meetings in public, they at once became the perceived standard bearers for openness and transparency in that context. And the effect of it was to placate the relatively small group of people who took issue with not being allowed to participate in those meetings, whilst at the same time effectively neutralizing in large part any complaints and criticisms that typically flow when work starts on any number of projects by saying it was all done in public. It is very true that you can please all of the people some of the time, or indeed some of the people all of the time. But alas, Mr. Speaker, you cannot, however, please all the people all the time. The complaints about the process today center, and we have issued statements to the effect, on the quality of the decision-making when it comes to difficult questions of choosing one set of interests versus another. It is in the context of the decisions taken vis-à-vis the Riso Bakery and the facade of the old police barracks as two examples that the quality of the decisions is called into question. The decisions made by the DPC in these two scenarios, as well as, say, the decision to allow the building of a rather tall structure right smack in the centre of town in Town Range, have caused consternation and anger in some quarters because, frankly, Mr. Speaker, the people can't vote a DPC out and replace it with another. Contrast those decisions with their decision some years ago not to allow the demolition of an entirely insignificant building with no heritage value whatsoever because of an in-principle objection to demolition. The makeup of the DPC today, with two government ministers sitting in the committee and the town planner having the chair, mean that there is no political accountability, certainly not a direct or technical one, for the decisions of this public body. The government, by divesting itself of the power to direct or lead the DPC on applications by private individuals and entities, has effectively freed the committee, and itself, arguably, of accountability at election time. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, those feeling sufficiently aggrieved about bad decisions could vote to punish the government out for having brought about this state of affairs, but the committee would continue in situ, doing what they do, taking the decisions that they see fit to take in all the circumstances, taking into account political factors, whether those are front and centre in their deliberations or not, when there's no apparent or overt political leadership of it. This is why, Mr. Speaker, we maintain the position in respect of which office should chair the DPC. It should not, in our view, be the office of the town planner, because, and I stress the point that it is the office of the town planner, because in the past some mischief has been done and some misinterpretation, and there has been misinterpretation of what I've said in the past, because it is not the person of the town planner, but the office of the town planner that I do not think should chair the DPC. It should be the office of the relevant minister, whoever that may be from time to time. I talked last year, Mr. Speaker, about the difficulties of the committee in controversial decisions by making reference to the application by the GFA to build the Europa Point Stadium. The fact that some say that the possibility of hosting top-level UEFA football depends on having the stadium at Europa Point make what are sometimes very emotive issues very difficult to ignore, Mr. Speaker. And members of the committee could be forgiven for letting such matters colour their judgment, which is not to say that they do, nor that they will. The point, Mr. Speaker, is that if, regardless of the prevailing sentiments at the time when the decisions are made, they are subjectively bad decisions in the eyes of a large number of the electorate, there's precious little that can be done to change the course set by the DPC. The Chief Minister might think it scandalous that I should be talking about power to the people, when his predecessor made no secret of being something of a control freak in many respects. That it's scandalous that I should be talking about these things when, under the previous administration, meetings would be held behind closed doors and minutes would never get published. But to such charges, there are simple answers. That was the policy of the GST then, and it remains the policy of the GST now. The situation we have today, which brings me to my final point in relation to planning, is that the government appoints the town planner as the chairman of the DPC, but its own projects are not subject to DPC approval. A GST policy position which has survived the New Dawn and is doing really very well. This, despite the fact that we're close to the end of the life of this Parliament, and the fact that they committed to making the government's project subject to the rules in the manner they promised. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, whether the Honourable the Chief Minister has made peace with the idea that he will not be ticking every box in the manifesto, like, for example, the parking under the Commonwealth Park, and that the luxury of not needing the approval of the DPC will prove too hard to give away. I see the Honourable Minister for Transport doesn't like it when I refer to the fact that that commitment is not delivered. It's just a little unticked box at the end of the day. Mr. Speaker, and talking about the park, and I can never resist talking about the park, because it really is quite magnificent, but there's no parking under it. It brings me to deal with my final area. Yes, I've looked, it's not there. It brings me to deal with my final area of responsibility, on which I will be addressing you today, and open my address on traffic and transport matters by citing a quote which I think, Mr. Speaker, you'll find rather apropos. It goes thus: "If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter." This is a quote I had originally heard attributed to Abraham Lincoln, but which, upon investigation, is said to have originated in 17th century France by the hand of a mathematician and philosopher by the name of Blaise Pascal, a scientist attributed with a clarification of concepts such as pressure and vacuums. In fact, pressure measuring devices have the PA of the Pascal on them in his memory. The quote, I think, captures very neatly the idea that the use of succinct and pointed language always trumps verbosity and unnecessary diversion from the crux of the issue. In the last few months, Mr. Speaker, since the publication of the STTMP, I think the acronym is correct, we have had many exchanges across the floor of this House. PP, thank you. I suspected I might be missing a P, despite our break a moment ago. We've had many exchanges across this floor, Mr. Speaker, about, I'll just refer to it as the plan. And in this House, and publicly too, about our differing views of this initiative, and that the government hails as something of a game changer. The Honourable Minister, who often complains about my use of language as being complicated or hard to follow, in question and answer sessions at least, paradoxically enough, touts the length of the draft summary of the plan as, or rather the draft plan as we established earlier, the draft plan, as evidence of the initiative's brilliance in what has become, in essence, a mine is bigger than yours argument. Well, Mr. Speaker, I hate to burst the bubble, but that's not what this is about. They have had the better part of 3.5 years to come up with the text of the plan, which, by extension of the concept captured by Pascal, Mr. Speaker, should have been plenty of time to make the letter shorter. Mr. Speaker, the plan should have been able to fit on a Rolodex card by now. You see, Mr. Speaker, it may be lost on the Minister that length does not on its own make an argument stronger in much the same way as shouting doesn't strengthen an argument or make truth of a lie, Mr. Speaker. Noise, Mr. Speaker, is just that. It adds nothing. It is for this reason that every time the Minister seeks to defend the lack of action on the ground of any real progress on our roads to tackle the traffic problem in Gibraltar by flicking through the draft of the plan, which goes to 30 pages, and has over 70 images and graphics, for good measure, Mr. Speaker, he does a disservice to himself and this community by effectively dismissing the genuine and important concerns many in this community harbour about the traffic situation. But why would he be so dismissive, Mr. Speaker? Why would the Minister for Traffic be so happy to effectively flick away the traffic problems of this community with a flick of the draft of the plan? Simple, Mr. Speaker. The Minister doesn't appear to perceive the problem, and it simply doesn't mean anything to him, but I'll come back to this point a little later. The draft of the plan looks impressive, certainly. I've said so here, I've said so publicly. It's very colourful, it has lots of images, and it really does help to capture the imagination when you have some images to guide your thought. I've already said openly in this House that if returned to government, the GSD would not be so foolish as to take the investment so far of well over £500,000 and consign it to the dustbin, Mr. Speaker, just because it wasn't our idea. I take no issue with the plan per se, though it is costing us, Mr. Speaker. In the financial year 2012-13, the cost was £87,561. The year after that, it was £337,700, and last year, it was £170,000. The estimate for next year is £243,000. The total amount to the end of the financial year next year will be £838,358. I don't take issue with the plan per se. I take issue with the fact that in the first place, the GSLP Liberals clearly didn't have a clue between them on what to do about traffic. So, effective as they are, as I have highlighted earlier in the planning context, in finding the path of least resistance, they committed to paying external experts hundreds of thousands of pounds to tell us what any number of local experts and stakeholders could tell us about to tackle the problem in Gibraltar already. tackling the culture of car use in Gibraltar by encouraging people to use alternative forms of transport, by providing an integrated public transport system with an improved and appealing safer environment for people to walk and cycle in. It's clear from the plan, Mr. Speaker, that car ownership and, importantly, car use is still front and centre in the thought process behind the plan. One of the initiatives supposedly designed to reduce congestion in the plan is to make more short-term parking available in the Lamport ditch area so that people who want to come to town to shop find it easier to park their cars. Mr. Speaker, this is in a report that acknowledges the increasing congestion and lists reducing pollution and congestion as one of its main objectives. It's certainly repeated enough, Mr. Speaker, hence the length of the document. This, allied to their manifesto commitment, which remains unmet, to deliver twice the number of parking spaces beneath Commonwealth Park, proves that this government is not serious about tackling the traffic issue. It lambasted the GSD when in opposition, despite the step change that administration brought about in the traffic context, and yet they are now failing in the same way they describe the GSD as failing, but only for them it's worse, because the backdrop of their failure is their supposed determination to undo the damage the GSD allegedly did. But we didn't kill the jibby bikes, Mr. Speaker. They did. We didn't bring buses to Gibraltar that the elderly or disabled couldn't use. They did. The starting point for them is clearly, the car is sacred, don't touch people's cars. If they were genuine about this process, Mr. Speaker, and didn't care about the electoral impact of their decisions, they would have set about introducing charging for parking in the town area, not cheap parking either. Parking fees at a rate that would make someone living in Montague Gardens and working in John Mackintosh Square think a few times about whether it's actually worth taking the car out para darse palo con la gente to find a parking, Mr. Speaker. They might have also reintroduced road tax, calculated it by reference to annual mileage. They might have also overhauled the import duty system and based it on emissions, so that more and more people will be persuaded to make better choices with their diesel/petrol cars. Because as we have seen, the uptake of electric and hybrid vehicles has been quite slow. They might, Mr. Speaker, even have contemplated measures such as banning vehicular traffic from the city centre beyond public service vehicles, or even introduced a congestion charge, a real hot potato in London. They might also, Mr. Speaker, have spent the $500,000 they've spent of McDonald's so far on renewing or replacing the jibby bikes, or on getting some cycle lanes painted, some advanced stop lines thrown into the mix for good measure. Maybe, Mr. Speaker, they could have even come up with a pedestrian crossing at Ragged Staff. Wow, Mr. Speaker, that really is phenomenal. The Minister announced the completion of a pedestrian crossing at Ragged Staff in the same way the Honourable the Chief Minister announced the second highest budget surplus in the history of this community. And in much the same way, or with much the same pizzazz, as the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition retorted that actually we are up to our eyeballs in off-balance debt. He doesn't tell you that it took weeks to complete a pair of traffic lights and access ramps, and that during that time it was a salve-se quien pueda affair of people running the gauntlet on the traffic during the school run because they weren't sure whether it is or it isn't a pedestrian crossing, Mr. Speaker. He likes his lines on the road. He likes his lines on the road. I wonder why we don't get more. He also talks about the crossing by King's Bastion. I must have been one of hundreds who wrote to him a long, long time ago suggesting that it might not be a bad idea to do it before someone got killed. I have welcomed the things that they have actually done. I was very quick to congratulate them on the installation of the intelligent traffic light system on Queensway, as well as the roundabout by the Marina Bay Ocean Village area, colloquially known, I think many of you will remember, as La Curva del Med area. And even the pilot scheme for drop-off and pick-up at St. Joseph's School, which has not been without its controversy. Valuable and effective though those initiatives have been, none of them can be described as revolutionary. It is the mere execution under the guidance of foreign experts of an understanding and expertise which is homegrown and was already here. There is nothing in that report that we didn't already know. The plan contains statements like, the border crossing causes congestion. What a shocker, Mr. Speaker. Another one, in future, the problem will be bigger if left untackled. Amazing insight, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the plan, with respect to McDonald, who have only done what they were asked to do, teaches the local stakeholders to suck eggs. It gets it wrong in one respect, however, Mr. Speaker. It says that car ownership is the problem. Well, car ownership is only part of the problem. It is the car use that's the issue, because the cars parked at home don't represent a problem. The GSD set about building car parks for people to park their cars at home, and at the same time was embarked upon delivering an integrated public transport system. All the government has done is to rid the community of the Commonwealth Parade car park, given us the park, and has then spent the rest of the time frantically trying to make up the numbers of parking. Why didn't they just say in their manifesto, we're going to give you a really nice park? Car parking be damned. It won't surprise anyone that the risk of electoral damage of eradicating 700 car parking spaces was probably too much for them to stomach. In Town Without My Car had some great ideas at the last election too, for using the city walls as a solution for walking and cycling. And it is good to see this incorporated in the draft plan, yet to be finalised after the second or third, possibly fourth round of consultation. I've lost count, Mr. Speaker. It is disappointing to be the lone voice criticising the government's lack of action on the ground, but I suppose they must be satisfied with just the fact of the plan and the adoption of an initiative rather than any substantive change on the ground. The plan, Mr. Speaker, even makes reference to public transport issues that the Europa Point Stadium might throw up. Did anyone mention a fait accompli? Of the many initiatives listed in the plan, what is the government waiting for to actually get cracking? The new bus routes, the introduction of bus lanes, well, I mean, Mr. Speaker, I can't wait to see that. They tell me there's no room for cycle lanes, yet they're going to make a bus lane along Waterport Road. There's already an effective solution in place for eastbound traffic, so I'm really looking forward to see what it is they're actually planning to do there, Mr. Speaker. But talking about Waterport and the Water Gardens area, I mentioned earlier that the Minister has no sense for the traffic problem, in some ways similar to me. He walks and cycles, as I walk and cycle, other than now in the summer, when it's too hot and I'm on my maxi scooter, Mr. Speaker. But he also has access to the official cars and frankly parks wherever he wants, Mr. Speaker, so he just doesn't get it. Which is probably why he finds it so amusing that I keep applying a few pascals of pressure on him to get the job done. I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that like sound travelling in a vacuum, my message is falling on deaf ears. The plan was always, I am certain, Mr. Speaker, for the government to let 4 years pass, fill them with consultation, planning and drafting, and then consulting, drafting and planning, to take them to publication of the full plan on announcement of the election. I note that token provision for a new linked road to the south and for the black cabs, two manifesto commitments that they will not deliver in this term of office, are now in the budget book. In the transport context, Mr. Speaker, I have to alight upon the issue of the new buses, and separately, the issue of the contract for advertising on the old buses and the bus stops. The red buses have caused much consternation. For all the talk of eco and user-friendliness, the buses have hardly lived up to the hype. That, and the fact that the award of the contract went to Macedonian Motors and that the government refused to disclose whether it was the lowest tender, have caused what should have been a victory for the government to leave a bad taste in the community's mouth. The government boasts of their eco-friendliness, but, Mr. Speaker, they are just diesel buses. They're not electric, they're not hybrid, they're not powered by chip fat, they're diesel buses, Mr. Speaker. The big publications issue is another example of where an allegedly impartial process resulted in the award of a contract ultimately to companies owned by stalwart supporters of the regime, much like the contracts for the solar panels, the lifts, the doors, etc. But in this case, it doesn't seem to have worked out. Since September last year, when I raised the issue, I've been trying to obtain from the government confirmation of how much revenue the bus company, and therefore the government indirectly, is missing out on because big publications hasn't paid up. Even last week, they still didn't know. Had it not been for my inquiry last year, Mr. Speaker, we wouldn't be pursuing the contract debt as actively as we are. And I am hopeful that substantial monies will be recovered and that a full account of the payment/commissions due to the Gibraltar Bus Company will be brought to this House. I also take the opportunity, before moving on to conclude, of reminding the Minister that the bus company's website, in particular the mobile version, and it's something that I directed at the former Minister for Transport, the Honourable Neil Costa, last year, but busy as he has been, it may have escaped his attention. That the website, in particular the mobile version, which appears to have been created using a free utility, which places third-party ads on the website, looks absolutely atrocious, Mr. Speaker. It does Gibraltar's image and that of our bus company no favours whatsoever. I wonder if the Minister could let me know how much that cost, and perhaps the government's brand consultants can cast their eye over it. More generally, Mr. Speaker, it didn't. I didn't. Great. I'm told, Mr. Speaker, that the website didn't cost any money. It might be time to spend a little bit of money on that website. Mr. Speaker, of all the departments that of all the departments, Mr. Speaker, of all the departments of overspent, technical services and traffic wasn't one of them, I seem to suspect. I think there was some kind of budget cuts imposed and nothing happened. So I'm sure, and failing that, of course, there is credit finance. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to move on now to well, yes, and it's interesting that Pascal was also credited with developing some theory which is relevant in the actuarial practice, and credit finance might also be interested in that. More generally, Mr. Speaker, and to develop a little further something that I've only briefly touched upon, I want to return to the issue of emissions. I note that the Honourable the Chief Minister has reduced import duty on hybrid vehicles to 0% for importers and to 5% for private imports. I wish to take the opportunity to impress upon him the fact that many jurisdictions are turning, as he may be aware, to calculating registration taxes on vehicles on the basis of the rated emissions of the vehicles in question. Whilst our system has served us well for a long time, I wonder whether I might be able to pique the Honourable the Chief Minister's interest into looking at this. You see, Mr. Speaker, as an example of the kind of anomaly that arises from our system, a Porsche Cayenne hybrid, which has rated emissions of 193 grams per kilometre of CO2, pays, if imported by a dealer, 0% and attracts a £1,000 bonus. However, a Ford Focus EcoBoost 1 litre has emissions by comparison of just 109 grams per kilometre of CO2, and yet that pays 12% and doesn't attract the bonus. The latter is the cleaner car, and from the local environmental point of view, the more desirable one. I understand that market forces may play a role here, but I am happy to discuss the issue with him should he consider it desirable to do so. No, indeed. And that, Mr. Speaker, brings to a close my contribution in this debate. I'd just like to say a few more, it's just a couple of pages, brief words on the State of the Nation address that the Honourable the Chief Minister gave yesterday and the economic performance of this place we call home. It is clear that much of the growth we have seen in the last few years is down in no small measure to the investment of the government in major projects. There is nothing wrong with that. Clearly, so long as there remains a sense of control and an objective assessment of what this community is, devoid of what our aspirations may be. Put simply, so long as we spend within our means, there should be nothing to worry about. We see that private enterprise is also taking the wheel in relation to a number of projects, all of which are in principle positive for this place. But questions still arise, which I hear every day, and I'll just take the opportunity of letting you have some of those questions. If we have one less bank and the new international bank does things as it is required to do by the terms of its license, then how is everyone going to get a mortgage for all the property that is going to be available to buy? How did we go from a £100 million hole to spending like there's no tomorrow? How exactly did we go from broke to spoiled rotten in a couple of years? Well, Mr. Speaker, some answers are harder to come by than others. And try as we may, we certainly can't get answers in the context of the construct that is the financing arrangement through the Savings Bank, Credit Finance Company Limited and Gibraltar Investment Holdings Limited. Should we consider contingent liability and actual liability? Who's right? Us? Government? Is there a right and a wrong? There are a lot of questions to which the answers are certainly not clear for the average person on the street. Many of the issues are simply too complex or too alien to men and women staying busy, paying mortgages, paying the bills, giving their children the best start possible, concepts which exist only in the abstract for them. We come to this House and debate these issues as the political leadership of this small nation, and it is our responsibility to do the best we can for the betterment and the improvement of all the lives in this community. The government owes a duty to the people not to put party political interests ahead of the greater good. It owes the people a duty, as the party elected to lead, to assimilate and to understand the challenges ahead. The party elected to develop a vision of where Gibraltar goes next and how we get there. It owes the people a duty not to get it wrong, like we owe the people a duty to keep the government on its toes. The economic output data that the Chief Minister yesterday set out was by any means good news for this place. Growth of 10.3%, economic output of £1.64 billion, full employment, over 24,000 in employment. Record this, record that, massive percentage increase here, massive percentage increase there. I am sincere when I say that it all sounds like great news, and not just for me, Mr. Speaker, but for my children too, because it means that the economy apparently continues to fire on all cylinders, that the financial services and gaming sectors that form a large part of the work I do as a professional, and what keeps my family in the blessed lifestyle to which I think a lot of us are accustomed, remain healthy. The only dark cloud I see in the distance has the name Credit Finance Company Limited on it, and were it not for the uncertainty of that view in the distance, on an otherwise sunny day, all the other issues we tackle here from time to time would seem that less critical, that little less important. I hope, for the sake of this place and the sake of the community at large, that things continue to go well for Gibraltar, and that we have many more years of plain sailing, on which it seems, Mr. Speaker, the government's economic and finance model is predicated. I hope too, Mr. Speaker, that should we ever encounter stormy seas along the way, that this economy's engine room is up to the task. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.